Picture this. A young Tsar stands in the frozen wasteland of Narva, watching 40,000 of his soldiers flee in terror, as Swedish cannons tear through Russian ranks like paper. The year is 1700, and Peter the Great has just suffered the most humiliating defeat in Russian history. But here's what nobody expected. This catastrophic loss would ignite a 21-year war that would reshape Europe forever and transform Russia from a backward kingdom into a continental superpower. I'm about to tell you the incredible true story of Peter the Great's bloodiest gamble. A war so brutal and transformative that it literally carved modern Russia out of blood and ice. If you love epic historical tales of triumph against impossible odds, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now, because this is just the beginning. The Swedish Empire in 1700 was the most feared military machine in Europe. Led by the teenage King Charles XII, they controlled the Baltic Sea like their personal lake. Sweden's armies were legendary, disciplined, experienced, and seemingly invincible. Then there was Russia, massive but primitive, with an army that European powers mocked as barely civilized. Peter the Great knew this humiliating truth, and it burned in his soul like acid. Our story begins with Peter's obsession. At nearly 7 feet tall, this giant of a man had witnessed Western military might during his travels through Europe. He returned to Russia consumed by one vision: modernizing his backward empire or dying in the attempt. The spark that lit this powder keg was Peter's desperate need for a Baltic port. Russia was landlocked, trapped behind walls of ice for half the year. Without access to the sea, Russia would remain forever isolated from European trade and progress. So in 1700, Peter made his move. He allied with Denmark and Poland to attack Sweden while Charles XII was distracted. It seemed like perfect timing. 3 nations against 1, attacking a teenage king who surely couldn't match his legendary father's military genius. They were catastrophically wrong. Charles XII wasn't just any teenager, he was a military prodigy, who would prove to be one of history's most brilliant tacticians. When the Great Northern War erupted, he moved with lightning speed that left his enemies gasping. First, Charles crushed Denmark in mere weeks, forcing them out of the war before Peter could even mobilize properly. Then he turned his attention to Russia with terrifying focus. At the Battle of Narva, Charles XII achieved what military historians still call impossible. With only 8,000 Swedish soldiers, he attacked Peter's massive army of 40,000 men in the middle of a blinding snowstorm. The result was a massacre that defied all logic. Russian forces, confused by the storm and panicked by Swedish battle cries, turned on each other. Entire regiments fled in terror, abandoning weapons, supplies, and dignity in the snow. Peter himself barely escaped capture, disguised as a common soldier. Thousands of his men lay dead or frozen in the Baltic winter. The Swedish victory was so complete that European courts began writing Russia's obituary. But here's where Peter the Great proved why history remembers him as truly great. Instead of surrendering, he used this crushing defeat as fuel for the most dramatic military transformation in European history. Peter disappeared into the Russian interior and began rebuilding everything from scratch. He didn't just want revenge, he wanted to forge a military machine that could stand toe-to-toe with Sweden's legendary armies. The scale of Peter's transformation was mind-boggling. He forced Russian nobles to shave their beards and wear Western clothing. He built new weapons factories from nothing. He hired foreign officers to train Russian soldiers in modern warfare. Most shocking of all, Peter literally moved the Russian capital. In the middle of a war, he began constructing St. Petersburg on conquered Swedish territory, a gleaming Western-style city that would serve as Russia's window to Europe. Meanwhile, Charles XII made a fatal error. Intoxicated by his victory at Narva, he turned away from Russia to deal with Poland and King Augustus. This gave Peter precious years to rebuild and prepare for the inevitable second round. When Charles finally returned his attention to Russia in 1708, he faced a completely different enemy. Peter's new army was equipped with modern weapons, trained by European officers, and burning for revenge. The Swedish invasion of Russia began like a repeat of earlier victories. Charles pushed deep into Russian territory, winning battle after battle. His soldiers seemed unstoppable, and European observers expected another Swedish triumph. But Peter had learned a brutal lesson from his earlier defeat. Instead of meeting Charles in open battle, he adopted a strategy that would echo through Russian military history. Scorched earth tactics combined with strategic retreats. As Charles advanced deeper into Russia, he found nothing but burned villages, poisoned wells, and empty granaries. The Russian army melted away before him like mist, always retreating, never offering the decisive battle Charles desperately needed. Winter was coming, and Charles faced an impossible choice. He could retreat to friendly territory and abandon his invasion, or push forward and risk everything on one final gamble. Charles XII chose to gamble everything on capturing Ukraine and its rich resources. He marched his army south, further from his supply lines, deeper into the Russian trap that Peter was patiently weaving. The Swedish army that had once seemed invincible began suffering horrifically. The winter of 1708 to 1709 was one of the harshest in European memory. Temperatures dropped so low that soldiers' breath froze before it left their mouths. Swedish troops, accustomed to the milder Baltic climate, died by the thousands from cold and starvation. Their supply lines stretched impossibly thin across hostile territory. Disease ravaged the ranks as relentlessly as the Russian winter. By spring 1709, Charles XII's once mighty army had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. But the Swedish king, stubborn to the point of madness, refused to consider retreat. The climax came at Poltava, a small Ukrainian town that would become the graveyard of Swedish imperial ambitions. Charles, wounded and carried on a stretcher, ordered his depleted forces to attack Peter's well-positioned army. The Battle of Poltava was everything Narva had not been, a complete reversal of fortune that shocked Europe to its core. Peter's modernized army, fighting on familiar ground with superior numbers, crushed the Swedish forces with devastating efficiency. Charles XII, the teenage genius who had terrorized Europe for nearly a decade, fled the battlefield in disgrace. His army was destroyed, his reputation shattered, and his empire's dominance broken forever. But the war was far from over. Charles escaped to Ottoman territory and spent years trying to convince the Turkish Sultan to attack Russia. Peter, meanwhile, pressed his advantage by expanding Russian control throughout the Baltic region. What followed were years of brutal campaigning across Finland, Poland, and the Baltic states. Cities were besieged, populations displaced, and entire regions devastated by armies that showed little mercy to civilian populations. The human cost was staggering. Historians estimate that over 300,000 soldiers died during the Great Northern War, with civilian casualties possibly reaching into the millions. Entire regions were depopulated by war, disease, and famine. Yet, from this carnage emerged a new European order. Russia's victory at Poltava announced to the world that a new superpower had arrived. Peter's empire now stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea, commanding respect and fear in equal measure. The war's end came not with a single decisive battle, but with exhaustion on all sides. Charles XII died in 1718 during a siege in Norway, struck down by a bullet that may have come from his own frustrated soldiers. With Charles's death, Swedish resistance finally collapsed. The Treaty of Nystad in 1721 officially ended the Great Northern War, confirming Russia's conquest of the Baltic provinces and Peter's transformation of his empire. Peter the Great had won his bloodiest gamble. The backward kingdom that had been humiliated at Narva was now the dominant power in northern Europe. The Baltic Sea, once Sweden's private lake, had become Russia's gateway to European power and influence. But the true legacy of the Great Northern War went far beyond territorial gains. Peter's reforms, forged in the crucible of conflict with Sweden, had fundamentally changed Russian society, military, and government. The service nobility system Peter created would dominate Russia for centuries. His military reforms became the foundation for Russia's later victories over Napoleon. His new capital, St. Petersburg, became the symbol of Russia's European ambitions. Most importantly, the Great Northern War established the principle that would guide Russian foreign policy for the next 3 centuries. That Russia's security depended on controlling its border regions and maintaining access to ice-free ports. The teenage Tsar who fled Narva in disguise had become Peter the Great, Emperor of all Russia, master of an empire that stretched across 2 continents. His bloodiest gamble had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. This incredible transformation from humiliating defeat to European dominance proves that in history, as in life, it's not how you start that matters. It's how you respond to adversity and learn from your failures. The Great Northern War changed everything. It ended Swedish dominance, established Russian power, and set the stage for centuries of European conflict. From the frozen battlefield of Narva to the triumphant halls of St. Petersburg, this war forged the modern world. If you found this epic tale of Peter the Great's incredible gamble as fascinating as I did, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. There are so many more incredible historical stories waiting to be told, and I promise each one will leave you amazed by the incredible drama of real history. Trust me, the past is far more exciting than any fiction Hollywood could dream up, and we're just getting started exploring these incredible true stories together. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye!